Hello, Slashaholics. Be sure to subscribe, click that like button, and click that bell. Also, check out the companion channel, the 80s Slasher Library After Hours, for all the great podcast and original content. Links are in the description below. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit. You can find those links in the description below as well as our merch store and the Patreon page. You can support the channel for as low as $2 per month, get some great stuff like free ebooks, free merch, voice a character in an audiobook narration, and so much more. Tonight's upload is brought to you by our patrons on the Patreon page. That's Tony DeVore, Tyrone Kennard, Nick Velcarve, Jeffrey Quick, Daniel Mackey, David Arnold, Alex Vanover, Krista Campbell, Rob Davey, Jay Gardner, Willow Ravenwood, Lauren Vaught, Kristen Kay, Michael, William Schaefer, Liam Anderson, Bree, Bonanza Jellybean, Ryan Woodward, Allison Seib, Iron Alexa, Hawaii, Cecilia Spears, Sean Campbell, Catherine McClear, Simonoli, and Carl Eakins. Don't forget to visit the 80 Slasher Librarian merch store. Lots of items, lots of designs. You pick the color and size. And be sure to use promo code 10OFF for 10% off your purchase. Link in the description below. Enjoy tonight's narration. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, the novelization of the film by Joseph Locke. Conclusion. Chapter 10. Dan had been pacing in front of the Craven Inn for 45 minutes waiting for Alice. That afternoon they had agreed to meet there, but she had not shown up and the Craven Inn had already closed. He looked up and down the dark, deserted street as he walked to his truck. The small, friendly town his family had moved to only months ago now seemed sinister and threatening. He got into his truck and sat behind the wheel. "All the towns in America," he muttered. "I had to move to the Bermuda Triangle." He folded his arms with a sigh and leaned his head against the back window. He felt sleepy. Alice slammed her bedroom door, stomped to her bed, and sat on the edge. She couldn't meet with Dan because her father wouldn't let her leave the house. "I lost Rick because I didn't watch him," he'd slurred, standing in front of the door. "I don't want to lose you, honey. We're all we have." She laid back on her bed, her muscles aching from lack of sleep, and closed her eyes. Just for a few minutes, she thought, relaxing until she snapped awake, thinking, Rick's bedroom window. She hurried down the hall to Rick's room, opened the window, and crawled out, shimmying down the tree. Once on the ground, she headed down the street toward town. In a few minutes, she was standing in front of the Craven Inn, but Dan was nowhere to be found. She searched the intersecting streets for his truck, but it wasn't there. A couple blocks down one of the streets, however, she saw a movie theater. The marquee read Midnight Show, Reefer Madness. Not wanting to go home to her drunken father, Alice walked to the theater, paid admission at the box office, bought some popcorn and a Pepsi at the refreshment stand, and went into the auditorium and found a seat. The black and white images on the screen cast a gray glow onto the blank faces in the audience as they stared at the movie, chewing their popcorn and milk duds. On the screen, a man was playing the piano and laughing maniacally as a man and woman looked on. Alice watched, trying to get into the film as she ate her popcorn, when suddenly the colorless picture changed to a filthy, run-down urban street. A howling wind blew crumpled newspapers down the sidewalk in front of a dilapidated building, with a sign over the door that read the Crave Inn. Alice's hand froze halfway to her mouth, and she gaped at the screen. It was the diner in which she worked, but much older and in much worse shape, as if she were looking at the Craven Inn 20 or 30 years in the future. A dry, chill wind began to blow through the theater, as if the screen had opened up and the wind in the movie was blowing through the auditorium. On screen, the wind grew stronger, pounding the already battered diner, howling around the theater in a swirl until Alice's carton of popcorn flew from her hand and scattered everywhere, and her hair slapped her face as it was blown around, and then the wind seemed to change direction, blowing back into the screen as it grew more forceful until the screen was sucking air out of the auditorium like a gigantic vacuum cleaner. The suction was strong enough to slurp Alice's Pepsi out of its cup and into the screen, strong enough to rip the front row seats from their bolts and down the black and white street in the film. And the wind grew stronger still until Alice screamed as she was sucked from her seat and through the air straight into the screen, where she tumbled painlessly onto the sidewalk. Gasping for air, she stood up and looked around. Her surroundings were black and white, completely without color, just as they'd been in the movie. The wind continued to whip around her. She opened the door beneath the Crave Inn's faded, broken sign and walked into the diner, where color was immediately restored. Turning to close the door, she looked outside to see the audience on the other side of the screen, oblivious to everything that had happened. They crunched popcorn and sucked soft drinks through straws, watching her intently. And seated in the fifth row, she saw herself, head slumped to one side as she slept. "No," she whimpered. "Wake up! Wake up!" The door slammed shut with a bang. Freddie stood behind it, grinning. Alice screamed and stumbled backward, flopping into a counter seat, where the waitress droned. "What'll it be, sweetie?" It was her, Alice, fat and old, with gray hair, wrinkled, pasty skin, and empty eyes. Alice stared at herself, her future self, in horror. "Well, what'll it be?" the waitress asked impatiently. "I don't want to be here forever, you know." "The usual," Freddie said, taking the seat beside Alice. He turned to her, and she could smell his foul breath as he said, "If the food don't kill you, the service will." The waitress slapped a large pizza onto the counter and shuffled away. But it was no ordinary pizza. What looked at first like meatballs were actually marble-sized heads with vivid faces. They were the faces of Freddie's victims, Kincaid and Joey, Kristen, Sheila, and Rick, and many others, all writhing in the melted cheese and screaming up at Alice in tiny insect-like voices. My favorite," Freddie hissed, lifting the pizza from the counter. "Cheese and carnage pizza!" He pointed a deadly blade at the pizza and began to chant, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo!" Alice screamed, "Rick!" when she saw that the blade pointed at a tiny version of her brother's head. "Alice!" Rick cried. "Free us, Alice! Free us!" Freddie stabbed the blade into Rick's forehead and plucked him from the mass of melted cheese, holding the head up before him. I just love soul food." Then he popped the head into his mouth and bit down with the wet, sickening crunch, chewing enthusiastically. "No!" Alice sobbed. "No, no, no, no!" "Yes!" Freddie hissed, holding her face in his hands. "More, Alice!
Bring me more!
He spun around suddenly and the diner's door flew open again. Now, instead of the theater audience, there was a room on the other side. It was a room Alice recognized. She'd been there before. It was Debbie's attic, filled with exercise equipment. Debbie lay on her weight bench, her arms dangled at her sides as she sighed wearily and closed her eyes. Freddie leaned toward Alice's ear and whispered,
She's getting sleepy!
"No," Alice whimpered. "Please don't hurt her no more. Please stop." Freddie sneered.
Your shift is over.
He clanged his blades together and Alice sat up in bed and looked around her darkened bedroom, cursing herself for falling asleep. She hopped out of bed, praying that Dan was still waiting for her. Meanwhile, Dan snapped his head upright and looked around behind the wheel of his truck.
Fell asleep, I guess,
he muttered. He spotted Alice hurrying around the corner in front of the Craven Inn and got out of the truck, sensing her urgency. "Come on!" she shouted. "We have to hurry. I'm driving." They got in the truck and Alice burnt rubber as they tore down the street. Debbie jerked awake on her weight bench and grumbled about falling asleep. She'd been waiting for Alice and Dan, working out to pass the time and keep herself awake, but it hadn't worked. Taking a deep breath, she reached up and lifted the barbell with a heave, but two horribly scarred hands closed over the barbell and pushed back down. Debbie looked up to see a hideous man in a floppy hat, his face badly burned, his right hand in a glove of blood-stained knives. She knew immediately that he was Freddy Krueger and tried to push back the fear in her gut. "I don't believe in you," she grunted, trying to resist him.
That's okay,
he laughed.
I believe in you.
He pushed down harder and harder until her elbows snapped with a horrible crunch and bone cut through flesh, making her scream.
No pain, no gain.
Driving like a lunatic, Alice exclaimed, "He's going after Debbie! I've got to stop him!"
You mean we've got to stop it, Dan said. I'm with you.
You just feel sorry for me.
Cut that shit out. Maybe before, but now I want to help you.
Here we are, Alice said, turning into Debbie's driveway. As Debbie forced herself to her feet, her broken arms dangled at her sides uselessly until her forearms broke off and thumped to the floor. Black, insect-like claws slid from the stumps of her arms and burst from her shoulders, growing longer and longer until she realized what they were. Cockroach legs, black and crusty and spiny, and Debbie screamed, "Give me back my body!" Dan jerked awake in his truck and spotted Alice running around the corner in front of the Craven Inn. Confused, he got out of the truck as Alice shouted, "We have to hurry, I'm driving!" She got in the truck and they screeched away from the curb. Debbie's body was literally falling apart. Pieces were dropping off. Skin was peeling and flaking to reveal the insectile body beneath. She staggered across the attic toward a small door that seemed to grow larger and larger as she got closer, with roach legs ripping through her workout suit, tearing her skin and replacing her legs and joints. She threw herself through the door, but her feet stuck to the floor and she fell forward. The floor was made of a thick goo, like the world's strongest glue. Her face plopped into the substance, cutting off her breath, and she pulled her head back, fighting the sticky substance until the skin peeled from her face, and she sensed the antennae that popped up from her head when she lost her skin, twitching this way and that as she looked around. She didn't want to see her face now. Never again. "He's going after Debbie," Alice said as she squealed around corners. "I've got to stop him." "You mean we've got to stop?" Dan stopped and looked around, blinked several times. "Wait a second. I got the weirdest feeling we've been through this before." Alice threw him a puzzled, confused look. Then it began to dawn on her. "Oh my God, we're asleep. He's got us going in circles." She stepped on the accelerator. "We've got to keep going." A few feet away from her, Debbie saw another roach struggling in the sticky substance, and she tried to scream, but it came out as a clicking, insect-like sound. Fighting the hold of the goo, she turned toward the door, spotting other roaches trapped in the thick slime. The door had become huge now, almost like a garage door. She struggled toward it, fighting, pulling herself along until an enormous godlike eye appeared in the doorway. Debbie inched forward, looked over the edge to the outside, and saw that she was inside a tiny box held in Freddy's hand.
"Welcome to the Roach Hotel,"
he laughed.
"You can check in, but you can't check out."
The walls began to crumble in around her, closing in faster and faster, until there was only blackness. Dan watched Alice as she maneuvered his truck through a suburban labyrinth, and suddenly she stiffened and her head jerked back with a horrible shudder as she cried out. "What was that?" Dan asked. "Debbie," she said, barely a whisper. "She's gone. I've collected her like the others." Her eyes widened, and Dan looked out the front window to see Freddy standing in the middle of the road. He knew it was Freddy, even though Dan had never seen him before. It had to be, and Dan shouted as Alice slammed her foot to the floor, shouting, "Okay, asleep or awake, I'm gonna punch his fucking ticket!" And the truck plunged forward, and Freddy grinned and waved at them, growing larger and larger in the windshield until the truck slammed into him, and there was the teeth-grinding sound of crunching metal, and then nothing. Alice was jarred from sleep by the impact and immediately pried open the truck's mangled door. Dan lay still, embracing the dashboard, his head pressed against the shattered steering wheel. The front end of the truck was hugging the fat trunk of a tree. "Oh, God," Alice stammered. "Sleepwalking. We were sleepwalking. That son of a bitch. He made us drive in our sleep. Oh, Dan, I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." She looked around to see that there was a car parked across the street, and an elderly couple was watching them. The man crossed the street, saying, "An ambulance is coming." The ambulance arrived minutes later, and after bandaging Dan's leg with gauze, they put him, moaning in pain, on a stretcher and lifted him inside. Alice got in too and knelt beside him. As the ambulance drove away, sirens wailing, one of the paramedics, a chubby, cocky man who seemed oblivious to the urgency of the situation, began filling a syringe with the clear fluid, checking it for air bubbles. "What's that do?" Alice asked. "Relaxes your boyfriend," the paramedic replied, preparing to inject the needle into Dan's arm. Alice slapped the syringe away from the paramedic's hand, crying, "No! He stays awake!" "Hey!" the paramedic slurred sarcastically, picking up the syringe. "Orders is orders." "He's allergic, okay?" "Well, you should have said something in the first place. Damn kids." Alice leaned close and stroked Dan's cheek. "Don't let them put you to sleep." Chapter 11. Later, in the emergency room, Alice stood across the room and watched as a nurse and an intern tried to inject Dan with the sedative. He was weak, but managed to make their task difficult. The doctor, Dan's parents, and Alice's father burst in suddenly. "When are you going to operate?" Alice asked the doctor tremulously. "Well, from the looks of him, probably in about 15 minutes. "Oh, God," Alice whispered, looking at the clock on the wall. 9:45. After one more look at Dan, she turned to hurry from the room, but her father grabbed her, his car keys dangling from his thumb, and held her back. "Alice," he slurred, "they'll help him." "They're gonna kill him," she hissed, then snatched the keys from him and dashed toward the door. "Alice, damn it, come back here!" She ignored him and hurried out the exit, running across the parking lot to his car. By the time she was on the road, driving well over the speed limit, the dashboard clock read 9:49. She had 11 minutes to save Dan, who at that very moment was being wheeled down a corridor on a gurney. He struggled inwardly to fight the slowly growing effects of the shot that he'd received a few minutes before. But the fluorescent lights were growing fuzzier by the moment as they passed slowly and monotonously overhead. He prayed Alice would be able to do something as she screeched to a halt in front of her house, raced from the car to the front door and let herself in, then hurried to the bathroom. Taking a bottle of her father's sleeping pills from the medicine cabinet, she poured several into her palm and said, "That ought to be enough for a trip on the Freddy Express," and then chewed them up, then hurried to her room. Standing before her vanity, she swept several of the pictures off the mirror so she could really see herself, then strapped on Debbie's studded bracelet, tucked Sheila's bug-killing gadget under her belt, and lastly tied Rick's oriental bandana around her forearm. Studying her reflection, she said firmly, "This ends now." Then she sat down at the vanity, feeling the first effects of the sleeping pills as Dan was lifted onto the operating table, the room being prepared quickly, with nurses checking instruments and doctors scrubbing up. The anesthesiologist appeared beside Dan and smiled down at him, lowering the gas mask slowly over Dan's face. "Now you just count backward from 100, the man said.
No,
Dan breathed.
I'll take the pain. Please, I have to stay awake.
But the mask covered his face and muffled his words, as Alice gasped and lifted her head from the vanity table to stare wide-eyed at her own reflection. She stood quickly, amazed by what she saw. It was herself, all right, but she'd changed. She saw in the mirror a turbocharged image of herself, leaner and tighter. Her jeans clung to her thighs, and her shirt was tied halter-like just above her waist. The bracelet had spikes where there were once rounded studs, and the gadget beneath her belt now glowed, as if emitting a powerful energy. "Fucking A," she whispered, as Dan opened his eyes on the operating table and looked up to see a surgical masked doctor bending over him. But the eyes above the light green mask, the eyes were Freddy's.
"Kruger!"
Dan shouted.
"Well, it ain't Dr. Seuss!"
Freddy said with an evil laugh. Dan screamed for Alice. Alice heard as the mirror shimmered like a pool, and Alice saw Freddy standing beside Dan, who lay helpless on the table. She took 3 steps back from the vanity, screamed, "Get away from him, you son of a bitch!" and ran forward, leaving the floor and shattering the mirror with a dead-on kick as she passed through the mirror and rolled over the operating room floor. Once she was on her feet, Freddy was gone. She went to the operating table and took Dan's hand. "Come on," she said urgently. "We're dreaming. You can get up now." He gaped at her as he stood, saying, "Alice, you look great." "Save it for later. Come on. We've got to get out of here." She led him to the swinging doors, pushed through them, and they found themselves in a long, dark tunnel with squiggly worm-like neon lights on the curved walls. It was a funhouse tunnel, the kind that turned slowly as you walked through it. Alice felt Dan squeeze her hand as they started down the tunnel, walking cautiously until Freddy appeared at the other end. He laughed and growled,
"Out for a lover's stroll?"
Then he leaned forward, gripped the edge of the tunnel, and turned it until it was spinning wildly, tossing Alice and Dan head over heels. They fought it, turning to crawl back toward the other end where the operating room door had been replaced by a round stained glass window, which grew larger as they drew near it, until they crashed through the stained glass and tumbled to the floor of an enormous, drafty church. Alice rolled over and knelt beside Dan, who looked dazed and weakened.
She heard a sound, a disturbing sound. Beeping, the beeping of the operating room heart monitor. "Alice!" Dan croaked as he began to fade, becoming more and more transparent. "Dan!" she cried. "No! You can't!" "It's too late, Alice! It's too late!" He grew dimmer and dimmer until he opened his eyes on the operating table and stared blearily at the faces of doctors and nurses. "No!" he shouted. "Put me back under! I've got to go back!" "Relax, son," the doctor said soothingly. "It was rough, but we pulled you through." "No! No!" Dan groaned as Alice stood and looked around the church cautiously. Soft voices began to sing from above, and Alice looked up to see several pale children, the emaciated children with bloated stomachs from the paintings in Freddie's living room, standing in the choir loft singing. A loud creak from behind made her turn as the 15-foot-tall double doors swung open to reveal Freddie standing in the doorway. He clanked his blades together and his voice echoed through the church as he called,
"Welcome to Wonderland, Alice!"
Alice smiled, feeling her strength, her energy, and shouted, "I'm gonna send your guts back to hell!" Bracing herself, she ran down the center aisle of the church and flew into a cartwheel, aiming herself straight at Kruger until her feet landed square in the middle of his chest, sending him backward. But he only laughed. She spun like a top, kicking with each turn, smacking her heel into Freddie's chin again and again and again. But Freddie only threw his head and roared with laughter, enjoying the fight. He moved forward suddenly, wrapped an arm around her neck and whispered in her ear,
"You think you've got what it takes? I've been guarding my gate a long time, bitch!"
Sweeping her up in his arms, he threw her across the church, and Alice slammed into the confessional, shattering it into jagged chunks of wood as Freddie shouted,
"You have their power, but I have their souls!"
Unharmed, she lay still a few moments, playing possum as she listened to Freddie's footsteps crunch through the rubble toward her until he was close enough, and then she jumped to her feet, swung her fist through the wall where the confessional had been, and closed her fingers around a fat electrical cable, ripping it out of the hole until it snapped in two with a shower of sparks. She snatched the gadget Sheila had made from beneath her belt and slammed the crackling end of the cable into the center of the device, and a glowing blue bolt of electricity shot from it, leaping across the gap between Alice and Freddie, and blasting him in the chest. Freddie released a gut-wrenching scream, and then stood still a moment looking down at his chest with amazement. Alice had blown a hole in the child killer. She could see straight through his chest to the pews behind him. She could even see his heart beating. Maggots squirmed from the thumping organ, and glistening black roaches skittered around the gory edge of the hole. Alice tossed her weapons aside and smiled until Freddie laughed and passed a hand over the hole in his chest casually. It disappeared. He was whole again. He grinned, moving toward her ominously.
"I am eternal,"
he said, smacking her across the face and then grabbing her, lifting her over his head and throwing her into the altar. She landed with a crash and looked up to see him advancing on her. She knew it was for the last time. His blades were poised, ready to cut. The children in the choir loft began to chant, "Now I lay me down to sleep, the master of dreams my soul to keep, for in the reflections of mine's eye." The remaining words suddenly came to Alice as if she'd known them all along, and she recited them with the children, at the same time sweeping a shiny reflective shard of stained glass from the littered floor. "Let evil see itself, and it shall die!" She held up the mirror-like glass, and it shined on Freddy's face as he gazed at his own reflection, and he staggered backward, his mouth yawning open to scream. But the voice that screamed was not his. It was the combined voices of his young, innocent victims, crying out in relief. He stumbled back against the wall as his red and green striped shirt began to pulse as something beneath it moved. Small, young arms reaching out of Freddy's chest and stomach, clawing at the shirt's material, until they tore through and the hands of Freddy's victims reached up toward his face, one clutching his jaw and pulling down hard while another dug its fingers into his eyes, and another closed on his throat, while another squeezed his neck, and another his scarred cheek, and Freddy's screams became his own, and his tortured voice bounced through the church relentlessly as his mouth was pulled open farther and farther until thick, dark blood sprayed from his eye sockets, and the horribly burned skin of his face peeled away like rind, and his jaw tore away with a wet crunch, and a shimmering multicolored stream of light rose from his split skull. The tiny voices of happy children sang from the light, and Alice watched it rise toward the shattered window above as the voices called, "Thank you! Thank you, Alice! Goodbye! Goodbye!" Freddy imploded and fell to the floor, an empty shell. The church was silent. The children were gone. Alice was alone. She walked slowly toward Freddy's remains, looked down at them a moment, and then hissed, "Rest in hell!" She slammed the huge doors of the church as she left. Chapter 12. Weeks later, when Dan was finally able to get out, they went for a long walk through Springwood Park, hand in hand. Both were bruised and cut, but the injuries inside would take much longer to heal than those on the outside. "I slept through all of last night," Dan said happily, "and I had no guests in my dreams." "I'm still having trouble," Alice admitted. "I manage 2, maybe 3 hours a night. I don't mind, though. Now I have more reasons to enjoy staying awake." She kissed him gently as they stopped beside a large fountain. Water sprayed into the air and cascaded into the round pool below. Dan fished in his pocket for some change. "Oh, come on," Alice laughed. "You don't believe in that stuff, do you?" "Yeah, I do, and I think you do too. Now, make a wish." He tossed the coin in, and Alice watched as the water rippled in response. As the pool's surface shimmered, Alice thought she saw, for just an instant, Freddy's reflection, as if he were standing across the fountain grinning at them. It was gone in the blink of an eye. "What did you wish for?" Dan asked, smiling. She stared at the water a moment longer as goose flesh crawled over her neck and back. Freddy was gone. Standing, she said, "If I tell you, then it won't come true." Holding hands, they walked away from the fountain, together. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, the novelization of the film by Joseph Locke. I hope you've enjoyed this book. This is technically book number 54 on the channel. I'm still putting out uploads of 52 and 53, but I did start those before this one. This was just a shorter book. But yeah, so let's talk about this book. Very short, but it's not like part 1 and 2 where it was just exactly the movie but in book form. We got quite a few little differences here, and a couple big differences. The biggest difference is Rick's death. We got the actual death from the script and not what they ended up having to shoot in the movie. You know, that really, really horrible Invisible Freddy Kung Fu fight scene. At least we got the real scene from the script with him, on the toilet, falls asleep. It turns into an elevator, and he falls to his death. And, that scene is so intense because his sister's there. She's trying to get to him. All the cheerleaders are pushing her out of the elevator. It's just nuts. But let's talk about some of the reasons I like this movie and this novelization and some of the things I don't like. The biggest thing I don't like, which I was hoping the book would follow the novelization of Part 3, but it didn't. It followed the movie of Part 3. So anybody who listened to Dream Warrior's novelization, I'm sure this was a bit confusing, but this novelization of Part 4 follows the movie, not the Part 3 novelization that's different than the Part 3 movie. So that's why it's like that. But I've always hated how easily Kincaid and Joey and Kristen were killed in Dream Master. It's like they went through all that stuff in Dream Warriors just to right off the bat be killed off by Freddy in Dream Master. And I was hoping the book would give us a little more explanation on how Freddy came back, why Jason the dog peed fire, something. But no explanation given. So that's another tick, off there. Because these authors, obviously, they can throw in some creative liberties. They're just choosing not to. You can hear those cars in the background, sorry. God, when I'm trying to narrate, it's like every motorcycle in my county will try to drive by while I'm trying to record a narration. But yeah, so the writer didn't take many liberties, but there were a few little differences here and there. And the most confusing one was the Craven Inn, because it already sounded like Craven when you say crave in. But yeah, so instead of crave in, it's Craven Inn. So it's Craven Inn, crave in. It's weird. But yeah. Now let's talk about the things I do like about the movie. I do like the kills. They're all pretty creative and fun. I love the whole soul food pizza thing. I'm glad I got to do that scene from the movie. A couple of the lines seemed a little bit different. I noticed that throughout the whole book. Some of the lines were a bit different than they were in the movie. And a few of the things that happened in the scenes were slightly different. In fact, if there's any that you caught in this book at all, please, in the comment section, let's make a list of differences that you guys caught from the movie in this novelization. That'd be a lot of fun. But yeah, so the kills were a lot like the movie except for Rick's. I do enjoy how when her friends die, they kind of go into her and help power her up. But then, when we get to Freddy, she uses all that power they gave her, but it doesn't really do nothing to him. He just, wipes away that hole and he's healed again. It's the mirror thing that finally does him in, the Dream Master nursery rhyme, which I always thought was pretty cool too. But I don't like that after all that sacrifice, her friends dying, giving her the power, it ultimately doesn't do a thing but buy her a couple extra minutes to figure out the nursery rhyme. That's all that really did. My favorite kill of the book is the same as the movie, and that would be Debbie's cockroach scene. Such great, in the movie, such great special effects for that. And in the book, I really enjoyed how the author wrote it out. It really put me there in the scene. I could just see it, but also I could feel what Debbie was going through. That panic and disgust. Oh, I just can't even imagine it. My biggest gripe about this author, Joseph Locke, if you're listening, I did enjoy the book. I just don't like the whole Alice walked down the hall and then she saw Rick. It's like there's a lot of that, and I have to read it that way because if I read it straight together, it doesn't really work. So if you caught on to that while I was reading, it's like, God, why is he doing that? It's because that's the way it's written, and that's the way it's supposed to be read. If you were reading it yourself, that is how he's trying to get you to read it. It's kind of a cliffhanger till the next sentence. Kind of like R.L. Stine did with chapters, except for this guy does it with sentences and paragraphs and stuff, and to connect one character scene to the next character scene. Which it's not too bad, it's just overly done in the book. I gotta say that it's overly done. The final showdown with Freddy, fun as always. I love the whole concept of all the souls in his chest and stuff breaking out, the arms coming out, they're ripping his face apart, tearing him to shreds. He falls into nothing. We all know he's going to be back in Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Child, which I will also narrate on the channel very, very soon, actually. There is no novelization for Freddy's Dead, but that's okay. That's the only one there's not a novelization for. So if there's any fans out there that like to write, maybe you could write a fan-made novelization to Freddy's Dead. Get with me, and I will narrate it here on the channel. Honestly, I will. And if you want to throw in some creative liberties with it, go for it. You know, make it your own. But a novelization of Freddy's Dead would be cool to add to the library here on the channel. There's a fan-written version of Friday the 13th 4, the final chapter that I'm going to be narrating later on this year or early 2021. That's going to be a lot of fun to see how that turned out. I know they took a few creative liberties, but still, you know, made sure to get the basic story in there. So yeah, guys, Alice's first chapter in the Nightmare on Elm Street universe is now complete here on the channel, and it was a pretty quick audiobook as far as getting the chapters out. I did enjoy it. I'll give it a rating whenever we discuss it on the Out of Print Slashers podcast. I don't want to give my rating yet. I'm going to think on it in a little while. But yeah, I always enjoyed the scene in the theater, you know, where she gets pulled into the screen, meets her older self. You know, Freddy's kind of casual.
The usual.
You know. I loved her relationship with Rick in the book. We got a lot more detail there, got in their heads a little more. And, you know, that sibling love and camaraderie and stuff was really great in the book. And he was really looking out for his sister. And I can just feel the pain she was going through when she lost Rick compared to losing, like, Sheila and Kincaid and Joey and stuff. But yeah, I enjoyed her scenes with Kristen. You know, I do think that just like the movie, the scene where Kristen gives her powers is a little too quick. I would have liked to have seen that drawn out a little more, but there was a couple slight differences in the book compared to the movie on that end. I always loved Sheila's death, you know.
Wanna suck face? You flunk, bitch.
Alright guys, yeah, so this has been A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, the novelization by Joseph Locke. Thank you all so much for hanging with me and listening. I'll be back here very soon with more slasher mayhem in audiobook form. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening, thanks for being awesome, be excellent to each other, and
pleasant dreams, bitch!
I'll see you next time.